This module focuses on consideration. As we discussed in Module 2, Restatement Section 17 says that in order for there to be an enforceable contract, there must be a bargain in which there is a manifestation of mutual assent to the exchange and a consideration. In this unit, we are going to look at the concept of consideration. Section 71, subsections 1 and 2 give us a definition of consideration. In other words, consideration for a promise is the thing or action that the promisor wants in exchange for his willingness to make a promise. The Latin phrase for this is quid pro quo, which translates as this for that. Understand that in almost all commercial contracts, consideration is not an issue. Almost all commercial contracts involve a promise to pay money in exchange for a promise to provide goods or services, or both. So if I promise to sell you my bike for $300, the consideration for my promise to sell my bike to you is your return promise to give me $300. And the consideration for your promise to pay me $300 is my return promise to sell you the bike, money for goods. Similarly, I can promise to pay you $30,000 if you design my house. The consideration for my promise to pay you $30,000 is your return promise to design my house. And the consideration for your promise to design my house is my return promise to pay you $30,000, money for services. As we saw in Module 7 on unilateral contracts, less frequently, we see contracts where one side promises to pay money in exchange for the other side performing some act. So for example, in the classic unilateral contract involving a reward, I promise to pay $500 to the person who finds my lost dog. The consideration for my promise to pay $500 is the act or performance of finding my dog. I'm not interested in your promise to find my dog. If you do find my dog, that both serves as your acceptance of my offer and functions as the consideration for my promise. At that point, we have an enforceable contract. So why do we need consideration? What is the function of the requirement for consideration? Basically, the requirement of consideration functions to distinguish contract, meaning a legally enforceable promise, from a promise to make a gift, sometimes called a donative promise. And why do we need to distinguish between these two kinds of promises? Under classical contract doctrine, a promise to make a gift is not a legally enforceable promise. The person promising to make a gift is free to change her mind at any time up until the gift is completed. Although later in the course we will find that some gift promises become enforceable under the doctrine of promissory estoppel or reliance. So the requirement of consideration is how classical contract doctrine distinguishes between promises that are legally enforceable and promises that are not. In the context of intrafamilial promises, that is, promises between family members such as parents and children or uncles and nephews, it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish unenforceable gift promises from contracts. Family members can and do contract with one another. A brother may sell his house to his sister, or a mother may hire her son to landscape her yard. But family members also often promise to do things for one another just because they're family. Or even more problematic, family members may make reciprocal gifts to one another. And in such cases, it can be tricky to distinguish a bargain for contract from a promise to make a gift. In older cases from the 19th century, often involving family members, you will see another definition of consideration. A promise has consideration when the transaction involves a benefit to the promisor or a detriment to the promisee. This definition, however, proved to be unsatisfactory because courts got distracted by deciding what was a benefit and what was a detriment. So, for example, if a father promises to give his son a new car if the son finishes college, is there consideration under this older definition? Is there a benefit to the father? Well, there's certainly no chance of a pecuniary benefit. Quite the opposite. Does the pride or relief he will get from his son being a college graduate count? Probably not. Well, then is there a detriment to the son? Consideration requires benefit to the promisor or detriment to the promisee, not both. One or the other is sufficient. Some would argue that there is no detriment to the son in having a college degree. Rather, that's a benefit. Others would say, in the context of the law of contracts, a detriment is doing something you are not already legally required to do or refraining from doing something you have a legal right to do. The son is not legally required to get a college degree, so his getting one at his father's behest is a legal detriment. Moreover, having concluded that getting a college degree constitutes a legal detriment, we are not done with our analysis. That is because a promise to make a gift can come with a condition, and a condition can be a legal detriment. So we could think of the father saying, "I promise to make you a gift of a new car, provided that you finish your degree." Finishing his degree is something the son is not legally required to do, and so it's a detriment. But that detriment is not a consideration, rather it's a condition to a gift. Williston, the drafter of the first restatement, used what has become to be a famous hypothetical to illustrate this difference. The hypothetical has become to be called Williston's tramp, and this, roughly paraphrased, is what he said. Suppose a rich man says to a tramp, "If you walk around to the corner to the clothing store, I will buy you a coat." Is walking around the corner a detriment? Yes, because it's something the tramp, the promisee, is not legally required to do. Is that detriment consideration, though, or is it a condition to a gift? Most agree that the tramp's walking around the corner is the condition to a gift. The reasons people come to this conclusion vary, however. Some would argue that walking around the corner is a condition to a gift, because in order for the coat to fit the tramp, he had to go to the store and try it on. By this line of argument, we can distinguish between detriments that are consideration and detriments that are conditioned to gifts by asking whether the thing, the detriment, is something that is a necessary precondition to receiving the gift, analogous to someone saying, "Put out your hand so I can give you this money." Putting out the hand is a detriment, you're not legally required to do it, but it is what one has to do in order for someone else to hand you the money. Others would argue that this is an inadequate distinction. They would point out that when the father promises to give his son the gift of a car, provided that son graduates, graduating isn't a necessary precondition. The father could give the gift of a car without the son graduating. Others would agree that walking around the corner is a condition to a gift, but the reason would be because of the context. There is no benefit to the rich man other than feeling good for having done a good deed, sometimes called warm fuzzies and generally understood not to be consideration, so we are left with the rich man conveying something of value to a homeless beggar. And our contextual understanding of that situation is that the rich man is being charitable and giving a gift to the poor man. These folks would conclude that in this situation there's no bargaining behavior occurring. They would say there is no bargain for consideration, and remember from the second module that bargaining is not the same as dickering. By the way, a student once proposed a variation on Williston's tramp that would suggest the walking around the corner was a bargain for consideration. Professor Threedy swears she's not making this up. The student said, what if the tramp walked with a limp? And what if the rich man got some sort of perverted thrill from watching people with limps walk? Then would the walking around the corner be the consideration for the promise to buy him a new coat? The response? Probably yes. Here, there's a benefit, albeit an idiosyncratic one, to the rich man. This would be no different than paying an entrance fee as the consideration for being able to watch exotic dancers. So, to return to our hypothetical with the father, the car, and the maybe graduating son. If a court were to focus on the context, family, father with a ne'er-do-well son, it would tend to suggest no bargaining, but rather a conditional gift. This despite the fact that there is a legal detriment to the son. A court could, however, focus on the fact of reciprocal inducement. That is, the father makes the promise to induce the son to graduate, and the son, apparently unlikely to do so on his own, graduates in order to get the car, and decide that this is bargaining, albeit in a non-economic context. With these close cases, you can't say for sure. So let's review this distinction between gift promises and contracts with an example from real life. When Professor Threedy was 8 years old, her family moved, and for the first time she had to share a room with her younger sister. She soon decided she didn't like this. The sister was always getting into her stuff. So she asked her father for her own room, repeatedly. Eventually he said, "If you don't ask me again, I promise you'll get your own room when you are 12. So for 4 years she didn't bring up the subject. On the morning of her 12th birthday, she marched up to her father and asked, "When do I get my room?" And then, and this obviously scarred her for life, probably led her to becoming a lawyer. Her father claimed to not know what she was talking about. So, could she have sued her father for breach of promise? Let's ignore the fact that she was a minor. We could approach that question from a sociological perspective and say that it's not a good idea to establish the precedent that kids can sue their parents for reneging on their promises concerning family governance. But classical contract would take this approach. It would ask, was there consideration for the father's promise? Or was it a gift promise? There was certainly a detriment. She was not legally required to keep her mouth shut. Arguably, there was even a benefit to the father, 4 years of not being pestered. The daughter would argue that there was consideration, a promise in exchange for performance. The father would no doubt respond that the not asking was a condition to a gift. As it was a gift promise, he was free to change his mind at any time before actually tendering the gift. And that's what he did. Was there bargaining? That is, were they exchanging 4 years' silence for the cost of building a new room? Or in context, are we looking at something that we should understand is not about bargaining? Professor Threedy thinks that a court would be unlikely to find consideration. Professor Kogan, a father himself, thinks a court would find the argument that her father was bargaining for silence to be compelling. What do you think?
Factually, issues regarding whether something is bargained for consideration or a condition to a gift most often arise in the context of family transactions, but not always.
Here's an example of the problem in a commercial context. It's the 1930s, and there's a depression going on. A movie theater holds a drawing and promises a gift certificate to the person whose name is drawn from a bowl at the start of the 8 p.m. movie, provided that the person claims the gift within 60 seconds of their name being called. A woman and her husband have entered their names in the drawing, and are standing in the lobby when the drawing occurs. The husband's name is drawn, but the movie theater refuses to give him the prize. Now, there was a factual question of whether or not he responded within 60 seconds, and a jury found that he had. The legal question on appeal was whether the promise of the gift certificate was a promise to make a gift conditioned on claiming it within the time frame, in which case the movie theater was free to change its mind before the gift was completed. Or was there consideration for the promise of the certificate? How would you decide the question? The court concluded there was consideration. It considered two factors. First, the court found that there was a benefit to the promisor, the movie theater, in the publicity generated by the drawing and the buzz created by large crowds at the theaters. Second, the fact that the promisor was a commercial actor suggested that this was a bargaining context. To summarize, in situations where there is an economic benefit to the promisor, whether it be getting $300 cash in hand, the return of lost property, or publicity, it is likely a court will find consideration for the promise. Let me repeat a point I made at the beginning. In almost all commercial transactions, consideration is not an issue. There is always consideration where there is a promise to pay money in exchange for a promise to provide goods or services, or both, and almost all commercial transactions can be characterized in one of those ways. However, where any benefit to the promisor is non-economic, which is sometimes called idiosyncratic value, a court will scrutinize the transaction more closely, taking into account the relationship between the parties and the context in which the promise was made. A court may still determine there is consideration, but the question will be a close one.